Hello to you and welcome back to India Global Week of 2020. I hope you've taken the time to grab a coffee, get settled, because we're going to begin the first of our sessions looking at some of the biggest issues raised not only by the Prime Minister this morning, but some of the most pressing issues for economies right around the world. Of course, our focus is on India and India's place in the world. Now, for the next 45 minutes, we're going to assess the Indian response to the COVID pandemic and what lies ahead. Clearly, there are challenges. The crisis might be unprecedented, but the big question, are there also some unprecedented opportunities to be had out of this crisis? So to discuss some of that, please welcome my panel joining me this morning. Let me introduce you to them. First up, Lord Jitesh Gadhiya, who is investment banker, businessman and member of the UK House of Lords with more than 25 years of financial services experience and a member of the UK-India Forum. Also with us, Sanjeev Sanyal, who is the principal economic advisor to the government of India. He's an internationally acclaimed economist, a best-selling author. He spent 2 decades in the financial sector and was named Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum in 2010. And also Ashu Khullar, who is the chief executive of Citi India. He joined Citi back in 1988, holding various roles in both the UK and India. He's also a member of the India Banks Association, on the executive committee of the Indian Chambers of Commerce, and the global board of directors at the US-India Business Council. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. It's a real joy to have you with us here for this first session on the first stream of India Global Week. And Sanjeev, maybe I could start with you. Talk to me first of all about the current state we find ourselves in with the Indian economy, given one of the most stringent, strictest lockdowns that was seen right around the world.
So good morning to all of you. You're absolutely right that we did go through a big lockdown starting end of March, but since the end of April, we have been systematically opening things up. So in that limited sense, of course, we have opened up the economy significantly. Economic activity is coming back steadily. But I think here we have to understand this is not just about a lockdown and a slowdown. This is the biggest economic shock the world has seen since the Great Depression and the Second World War. And it is still playing itself out. So I think the interesting thing here as a policymaker is how do you respond to so much uncertainty? There is a lot of uncertainty about exactly how the health crisis itself will pan itself out and what its economic dimensions will be. So that's still playing itself out, of course. But there is a more profound shock and discontinuity we need to think about, and which is this. It is not just about re-inflating the pre-COVID world, whether in India or worldwide. We have to recognize that the post-COVID world will be fundamentally different. It will have its own supply chains, its own geopolitics, technologies. Consumer behavior may have been structurally and fundamentally shifted. So I think given all of this, as a policymaker, I have to be very, very careful not to simply press the accelerator on demand and try and reinflate the world we left behind. And so this is the context in which you will see our policy responses. First, we have included a lot of supply side measures in our policy response, which is quite different from many other countries. We are focused much more on demand. And the second thing is we have looked on this as a marathon and not a sprint right from the beginning. So although we have announced packages along the way, most of the packages so far have really been about cushioning the demand shock. We haven't, so far at least, been going into the rebuild of demand phase. We will in the future. We do have monetary and fiscal space to do that. But the point I'm making to you is our approach has been somewhat different from many other countries. And the reason for that is this issue about dealing with uncertainty.
Yeah, and we'll come on to that, the difference, I suppose, between the demand side support and the supply side support, and that a fundamental issue. And also you raise there that the real challenge for governments around the world, which is essentially trying to answer problems that haven't actually occurred yet. It's preempting issues and trying to answer things that we don't really know how they will play out. Let me bring in Ashu Khullar. Ashu, I mean, we heard there from Sanjeev about the challenges ahead right now. It's really difficult to know what some of those challenges may be, but give me your assessment, first of all, of how India looks right now and what some of the most pressing issues will be to tackle.
Yeah, Ben, and I think, as Sanjeev said, I think this is certainly the biggest crisis I think we've all faced, perhaps since the Second World War. So it is uncharted territory. I think it's also a health issue at the heart, which is affecting the economies, given that, the shutdown basically has a huge impact on both the supply side and the demand side. So, and in countries like India, I think things get a bit more complicated, just given the way the urban density works, some of the healthcare infrastructures. And let's be candid, I think the fiscal headroom, which I guess we have to play with, is not the same as, for example, what, the US, Japan, UK, and some of the other countries have to play out. So I think I have huge sympathy for the points Sanjeev made. I think policy making in such an uncertain environment is not easy, and you're trying to balance various things which are not easy to forecast. So I think my assessment is this, that I think obviously Q1 in the fiscal year for India is going to be very difficult. I think you're probably going to see more than a 20% contraction in the GDP. I think the financial results are going to be quite difficult. I think, but the good news is I think the supply side is easing up a fair bit. And talking to our clients, at least, it seems increasingly, while there are certain supply challenges, such as, for example, migrant labor, which went back to the villages, I think increasingly the constraint is perhaps going to be the demand side. And I think as long as there is, beyond the lockdowns, I think people are scared to get on with their normal, living, you're going to have an impact on the demand. And obviously it plays out differently from sector to sector. But I must say, I think RBI has been terrific. I think they have been very proactive in terms of providing liquidity, cutting rates. And I think we're starting to see early indications of risk-taking come back in a small measured manner. And I guess, you mentioned the stimulus, and we'll probably end up talking more about it as well. But there was some very, good monetary and credit support impact, especially to the most impacted segments, whether it's the poor or the low end of the MSME space. So you can see where the government is trying to put its energy on.
Yeah, and with that in mind, Lord Jitesh, there's a lot of talk, isn't there, about whether economies will bounce back in an L-shaped fashion, a U-shaped fashion, a V-shaped fashion, and everyone's trying to guess which one it will be. But as we heard there from Ashu, this is about consumers being nervous about going outside and spending again. How would you assess what the recovery will look like in India?
Well, good morning, Ben. First, let me say that it was very interesting listening to the Prime Minister open the Global India Week, and I think we couldn't have asked for a better warm-up act for this panel, since he specifically spoke about Indian reforms. But joking aside, having hosted the inaugural UK India Week in the British Parliament last year, it's fantastic to see this event go both global and virtual this year. Coming to your specific question about the shape of the recovery in India, and I think this is an open question for the world too. Look, we don't have a playbook on this, as Sanjeev and indeed Ashu alluded to. And I think when you have both a supply shock and a demand shock simultaneously, the thing, and Ashu mentioned this just now, I think it's the confidence is the golden thread that runs through both of these, both from a consumer sentiment perspective, but also from the corporate investment side. And therefore, in the spirit of this being a a marathon and not a sprint, I think that there is a risk of mistaking what could be a U or a W for a V, and I don't think actually anybody really now feels that this is not going to be anything other than a extended, protracted recovery phase. It may be a bit crab-like in its shape, in the sense of moving sideways as well as forwards. And a lot of this, frankly, will depend on co-managing the health risks. So remember, in Western Europe, we think that, because we've partly done this sequentially, where we've had these big lockdowns and then we're opening up, India hasn't got that luxury. It's having to manage the healthcare element alongside the economic and flattening both the pandemic and the unemployment curve at the same time.
Yeah, and I just want to remind anyone watching this, please do submit any questions you might have for the panel. You can do so on the live stream there, or use the hashtag #BeTheRevival, and I'll make sure to include some of your thoughts or comments with our panel. And you'll forgive me for looking away from the screen at those messages that come in. And just to remind you who we have on the panel with us, an esteemed panel of guests. From the right of your screen, Sanjeev Sanyal, who is the Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India. In the middle, Ashu Khullar, Chief Executive of Citibank India, and Lord Jitesh Gadhiya, who's an investment banker and member of the UK House of Lords. Let's continue, because maybe Sanjeev, when you look at the economy right now and you're trying to come up with policy, you're trying to work out who to help first. As always, but particularly right now, there are conflicting demands, there's conflicting interests, there is a finite amount of resource and an infinite number of places that you could spend it or support. What are your priorities? What do you feel is the most pressing issue to tackle first?
So in the last few months, we have been very clear that we are basically trying to provide a cushion for the most vulnerable sections of our society, whether it's the very poor or for the MSME sector in the economy and so on. So if you see the kinds of interventions we have done, you will see that, for example, very early on, we used direct transfer of resources, whether it's money or food and so on, to the very poor, using unique identification work that we have built over the last few years. Similarly, for the small industry, we have given 100% guarantee incremental loans to them from banks. So the government has given 100% guarantee to $3 trillion rupees worth of resources that the banks can lend on. So what we have basically done so far is essentially provided a safety net for the system, and it's worked reasonably well. I mean, who would have thought that 1.3 billion people would have remained for 4 months in a lockdown, some of the most severe lockdowns in the world, and with relatively little social stress. However, we are now opening things up. So we are now going to go into a phase where we are going to begin rebuilding things. And contrary to what many people may tell you, we actually do have more ammunition there than people think. First of all, we have lots of monetary space. In fact, we are one of the few countries in the world with a lot of monetary space, because interest rates here are still significantly positive. So this is not like, say, Western Europe, where you may be having 0 to negative interest rates. Even in the UK, you're basically at 0 interest rates. You can't really use your monetary tools very much. That is not the case in India. I mean, the government of India still borrows at 5.8% for 10-year paper. So there is significant scope for lowering interest rates in India, and the Reserve Bank has been systematically lowering interest rates, and it is bringing down the whole structure of rates in India. It takes some time for transmission, but it's happening. Even on the fiscal front, we do have some space. I mean, our debt to GDP ratio is actually significantly lower than that of the US, UK, or many of the Western European countries. So sure, I mean, we need to maintain control over that. And you don't want to go and be, profligate about the whole matter. But even while remaining responsible, we do have some space for going out there and sort of pumping up things like large infrastructure projects and so on, which will, as we go into the rebuild phase, can be used to rebuild demand. So there are things that we can do, and but there's no point in doing that while we were in lockdown, because we got in a lockdown and you're trying to increase demand, there's no point. But as we get into the rebuild phase, we open up the lockdown, certainly we will be in a position to use various tools to rebuild demand, and the supply side will be able to respond to it. And of course, then there is the supply side reforms that we are doing, whether in terms of freeing up agriculture or labor reforms and so on. And the idea there is to be able to provide enough flexibility to our factory markets so that we can respond to this new world and adapt to it, irrespective of what this new world turns out to be. Because as we just discussed, very difficult to tell what exactly will happen. But the most important thing here is to be flexible, open-minded about how this will pan out.
Yeah, and Jitesh, on that point, how difficult is it to plan, but with so much flexibility built in that it starts not resembling a plan? It's very difficult to put, action into place if there are so many ifs, buts, and maybes, isn't it?
Look, I think the key thing here to realize is that we are not into doing first order plans. The first 40 years of India's independence, we spent doing these 5-year plans, prescriptive plans. So that is not at all what the Prime Minister's vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat or self-reliant India is about. His idea is to open things up in such a way that there is flexibility to it. So have labor markets that are flexible. So labor reforms, although we are introducing other things where we strengthen labor rights as well, for example, on safety, working conditions, etc. But in terms of the market, we are trying to make it more flexible. Similarly, there is an emphasis that in non-strategic areas, we are quite clear that we are going to have privatization. We used to use words like disinvestment, etc. as euphemism for it. Here, for areas that are non-strategic, we are clear that we will privatize, and the Finance Minister has said so. So there is a second order plan, so to speak, or a strategy, rather than having a first order prescriptive idea of exactly how this will pan out. Now, this kind of flexibility does require that we have states, the Indian states, playing along, because eventually, when we try to insert ourselves into global supply chains, factories have to be located in a location, and that's really, those changes have to be done at the provincial, even local level. And so that is where a lot of the interesting reforms are beginning to happen as well. So we're quite serious about this flexibility issue.
Yeah, Lord Jitesh, let me bring you in on this, because look, when you're speaking to businesses on the UK-India Forum, what do you tell them? How do they prepare for something that we don't actually know the full extent of? We don't know how it's going to affect consumers. We don't know how it's going to affect demand and supply. How can they plan?
Look, I think when you're faced with this type of situation, you have to sort of plan for the worst and hope for the best. So from a business perspective, I think the planning horizon is well into looking at this as a multi-year recovery process. So, whilst I think many of us would hope for a scientific breakthrough in the autumn, I think the reality is that most, sort of sensible businesses would be planning for, fresh waves, for what everyone calls a second wave. Certainly in Europe, I think the issue is that coincides with the sort of winter flu season, and therefore, a different sort of pace and intensity potentially. But look, you also have to then, have a planning horizon that also plans for recovery. And whether that comes in, once you have a vaccine or effective therapeutics, you do have to look at what are the medium-term drivers of demand. And this is where I think India needs to differentiate itself, because I think, we talk in terms of epochs, before BC, before COVID, with COVID, WC, but then there will be an after COVID, right? There will be an AC period here. And in that AC period, after COVID period, I think, as the Prime Minister said in his opening remarks, I think India should rightly seek to be an important part of that. And I think, Sanjeev mentioned supply chains. I think there really is the key pivot. And I think here I would say India can't wait around. It needs to be relevant to those relocations. Otherwise, it'll go to Vietnam or Thailand or elsewhere. And therefore, some of the critical things he mentioned, particularly labor sector reforms, land reforms, to go alongside some of the market reforms of agriculture that are already being implemented. Some of that, I think, I hope India puts its sort of foot on the accelerator on.
Yeah, and Ashu, Sanjeev was talking there about how India has more wiggle room when it comes to monetary policy. How significant is that? And does that compensate perhaps for some of the areas where it has less flexibility financially?
Okay, listen, I'll never argue with Sanjeev because he's a trained economist. So I'll never take him on that. But what I'll say is this: I think I agree there's more headroom on the monetary side, but I think the monetary card has been played well. I think liquidity is not an issue right now. I think it's probably more, risk taking, and that is more inhibited, or frankly, even demand for funding because of, I think, what's happening on the economy. So while it's good to know that there is headroom and tools, at some point, I think the question of trying to boost the demand, which will come through the fiscal side. And again, I think it's heartening to hear that there is a plan which is long term, and I think there's more headroom. Because, and the other thing which I'll note is, I think the rating agencies have all come up with their statements or rating changes, which is good because that means having taken those actions, they're not going to be trigger happy, I hope, and will give us whatever a year for the government to take certain actions. And I think at some point, the fiscal would have to come into play because, there is so much that monetary can do. And that's something which I think now how that money gets spent. And I can imagine the focus would be to try and avoid too many job losses, which obviously is going to be a criteria. Too many defaults, which has a spin-off impact on the financial system. And we haven't talked about financial system, but while I think the moratoriums are good, it does, kind of just postpone the problem. You would have a rise in NPAs, and I think the financial sector will also need reform, more capital, if you have to keep the engine, of the growth going. The other thing would be, I think, the point which Lord Gadhiya made. It's quite easy when you are going through a fog as thick as we're going through right now to forget a lot of the secular positives which India has. And, we are a global bank, so we talk to a lot of global countries, global customers. And I think this whole supply chain opportunity, which is going to be a multi-year opportunity, is something which we should really seize up. And again, from what I hear, the government at the senior most levels is very focused to try and see, and they've already done a lot of good things, right? I mean, the corporate tax reform puts us at the most competitive edge of, on the taxation side. I think the infrastructure build-up has been pretty solid, but I think there are friction points and pain points which need to be addressed, which apart from playing out the supply chain positives, also I think dovetail very well with boosting the manufacturing side in India, which is also a big generator of employment. So I think you kind of get multiple benefits if you can fix some of those pain points.
And just a word on your exposure. When you look at the business that you do in India and indeed globally, you've touched on that, you speak to your clients around the world, but your exposure in India, what worries you the most? Where are the points where you think, hang on, this could take longer to recover than other areas?
I think the consumer side is obviously, as you can imagine, impacted. And I think that's going to get linked up with people's confidence about their jobs, livelihoods. There's also going to be a bit of a payment shock when we come out of the moratorium. So I think we'll have to manage through that, and that's very much linked, as I said, to the economic recovery. I think the MSME is again the other space which is more vulnerable, and I think that's why I think in a lot of ways one of the best elements of the stimulus package was that $40 billion government guaranteed scheme, which was critical because otherwise those guys had no access to credit. But I think you got to watch that space. So those are the two areas which I'd be more focused on, Ben, to answer your question.
Yeah, and Jitesh, when you look at the scale of this reform package and the stimulus that is being offered, do you feel it's enough? And I know it's very easy for us all to say, yes, throw money at this problem and it makes it go away. We've discussed that there are finite resources, but it's an unprecedented crisis that needs an unprecedented solution. Is this enough, and is it targeted in the right place?
Well, I think I would just really build maybe on some of the earlier comments. I think that it's a point, it's a question of calibration, right? And I think, you've seen in Europe, take the UK's example in today's Financial Times, they estimate that in the UK, we will have a £350 billion deficit, in excess of, in fact, representing almost 18% of GDP. Now, frankly, yes, I think that may be necessary, but that this will ultimately have to be paid, and we'll have to handle it in a sustainable way. India has got a bit more headroom, but to suggest that a country of the sort of nature and structure that it is can handle those types of deficits, I think is not realistic, and therefore it's cutting its cloth according to its circumstances. On the monetary side, I do think that whilst the RBI is independent, I think there's a lot more that could be done. So, look, I think this is almost a situation where any amount of stimulus will not be enough. And in fact, actually the wrong type of stimulus, when you've got a supply shock and a demand shock, could actually make things worse, not make things better. So there's an element here of bracing ourselves. Yes, relief in the short term, recovery now. But as I think Rishi Sunak said, there's a trilogy to this. And planning for reform and the revival, to come back to the theme of this conference, the revival, I think is so crucial here. And this is, again, back to I would say, the India opportunity. It would be such a waste of this crisis if we came out and we had all the same issues recurring on another panel like this next year or the year after. We've got to seize the moment now.
Yeah, Sanjeev, are you seizing the moment? And I ask because if we compare this to the reforms of 1991, those reforms brought about by a contraction of something like 1% in how the economy was performing. We're on track for some double-digit contractions in the economy, not just in India, but indeed around the world. Is it enough? This is an unprecedented crisis, and as we heard there, no amount of money will be enough. But this involves something pretty radical, something brand new that hasn't been done before. Are the reforms that you've announced enough?
Well, whether or not they're enough, I'll leave it to you to decide. But I'll tell you, there are a few things that you need to understand in terms of what are our degrees of freedom, and that will explain to you how we operate. So first of all, as Jitesh pointed out, there's no point in really throwing huge amount of money. Remember, all the money you're throwing is actually out of debt. Someday you'll have to repay that debt. So this is not free money. And there are already, for example, in the US, very large package. It's sent out, as checks to the population at large. But then what you discover very quickly is those checks are taken and just saved. So what happens is that the demand boost you would have expected from giving that money out doesn't really come back in the way people expected. So you've used up the ammunition, but you haven't had the demand, second order demand flow from it. So we have to be very careful not to simply spray money everywhere and hope something ignites. It has to be done in a calibrated way. And we have so far, and I've said this before as well, so far we have actually done this much more step by step than many other countries, which have opted for one big package kind of approach. So we have done it in many smaller packages so far. And the aim of that so far has been to cushion the shock for the more vulnerable sections of our economy. Going forward, we will begin to ramp things up, but we will do it in tandem with supply side measures. And here, the analogy with 1991 is very interesting, because you have to remember in 1991, yes, the economy slowed down as it has now, so that is similar. But there is one major difference. In 1991, we had a breakdown in macroeconomic balance. Now, that is totally not the case right now. I mean, our inflation is very well controlled. It's close to zero. We are actually accumulating foreign exchange reserves rather quickly. Foreign exchange reserves have grown past $500 billion of reserves. So on some fronts, actually, the economy is extremely stable. We are running a current account surplus, which is quite unusual for India. We usually run deficit, and so on. So there are many areas where, in fact, the economy has gained in strength, or in a sort of way, in a sense. So that gives us freedom of a sort. So it means, for example, when we ramp up demand, we will not have to fear triggering inflation. We don't have to worry about the rupee spiraling down. In fact, if anything, if we weren't accumulating reserves, the rupee would have been appreciating right now. So there are many degrees of freedom. And if we add to that the fact that we are in a position to do big structural reforms, supply side reforms, and get potential gain from it, which many other countries may not get, because there are more supply side things to be done in India than many other places, then the bounce from it can be quite strong.
Let me take that thought, because I want to look at opportunities here as well. Ashu, it's easy for us to talk about the risks and the dangers and what may transpire as far as economic contraction is concerned. But this is all about creating an opportunity. Where do you see the opportunity here? And particularly, I'm thinking about luring business away from China, given what's happened, towards India, and India taking its place.
So, of course, sorry, is this for me?
Sorry, I was addressing that to Ashu, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, Ben, I think, again, as we look at India, and I think a lot of investors look at India, especially the ones which have a long-term perspective, I think the fact that we have a young population, with less than a 50% dependency ratio for the next, 35 odd years, the fact that I think the digital backbone which has been created, and I think that's something which we got to give a lot of credit to the government for having created a world-class digital infrastructure, and I'll link it up to the opportunity in a minute. I think the fact that obviously these young people, there is a trend towards obviously ongoing consumerism, given the per capita consumptions in a lot of products is very low in India, and the urbanization. So I think the secular trends in India through this period of uncertainty are very strong. I think in terms of the opportunity, I think the supply chain opportunity is obviously right there. I think we'll have to work hard to get it, because as I think Lord Gadhiya mentioned, there are a lot of people who are going to try and do the same people. And China is also not sitting idle, and it's a big market. So I think it's going to be a bit of a combat, but I'm very pleased that the government is taking it very seriously. And I know because we're part of certain, federations and giving our inputs, and obviously we'll do our bit to take that narrative out to the customers. But beyond that, I think the opportunity in India as a knowledge economy to try and go beyond, what we've done on the IT and IT enabled side and get on to the more sophisticated end, where again, I emphasize, if you look at the digital infrastructure which is in there, you don't have to invest so much. It exists. One of the big trends which also you're going to face, which we are seeing in this crisis, is the whole digitization of every part of the economy is getting a turbo boost. The most analog parts of businesses are having to make that movement. And I think, to me, beyond the manufacturing supply chain opportunity. I think it's exploiting that whole digital opportunity and going, upper end on that place, which I think is a very natural space for India to play on.
Yeah, we've got 3 great sessions actually this afternoon on this channel looking at that digitization and the role that it will play, and technology just changing fundamentally everything. Lord Jitesh, a couple of points on getting into India to seize on those opportunities. I've got a few questions coming in from viewers who are watching this, talking about the Prime Minister's introduction, saying India is open for business, come here, set up here, work here, we want you. But they talk about the difficulties and the hoops that they have to jump through. It's an issue that we've talked about time and time again. It doesn't seem to change a whole lot, does it?
Well, look, I think this is a recurring issue, but what I am at least encouraged by is the fact that this, what's euphemistically called ease of doing business and the monitoring, the sort of measurement and monitoring of that actually has been a focus of policymakers. So we all know that, and I forget the ranking, but it was, pretty poor, 140, 50, whatever it was in terms of the World Bank rankings, and that has dramatically shifted upwards. And so I'm encouraged by the fact that there is a focus on this. What's interesting, though, and I hope this is a sign of things to come, is that actually this crisis is being used, from what I can see, to accelerate some of that ease of doing business measures. So Sanjeev mentioned agriculture. Actually, in agriculture, and the Prime Minister mentioned this in his speech, there's some market reforms which effectively remove the intermediaries from the system so that farmers can go direct to consumers in India. And therefore, the Prime Minister was talking about storage and logistics, therefore being an important next step in that. Obviously, land reform is another one that would be. And so what I would hope is that, and you're seeing it on some of the labor reform areas as well, is that, to put this graphically, I hope there is a bonfire of red tape and regulation that this crisis spurs out of necessity. Sometimes, countries have to reform out of choice, but sometimes you do it in times of crisis out of necessity. And I know the Prime Minister said that India is a natural reformer. Whether it is or not, this crisis will absolutely spur that on.
And I want to come back to the both of you to ask about what you might have learnt about either yourself or the economy or the way that we work from this crisis. But Sanjeev, let me just bring you in on that point there. Will you commit to that bonfire of red tape that we've just talked about to make it easier? Use this crisis as an opportunity to actually fundamentally make it easier for business to operate in India.
Absolutely. We are making huge number of changes. But if there are changes which you or Jitesh or Ashu think that should be done, we'll be very happy to consider them. There are a lot to do, both at the central government level, but at the state government level as well. And some of the states have really been at the forefront of doing reforms on land and many other areas. So it's not just the central government that has been out there. But as I said, we are always open to feedback. You tell us the changes you need, and we will very much consider doing that.
Good. I'm sure they will take you up on that offer. And Ashu, just a word from you. What have you learned about maybe business, the economy, or yourself during this crisis? What has it taught us unexpectedly?
Let me talk about the business side, Ben. I think it's extraordinary, the resilience which most businesses have come through, because, we all think about continuity of business and you think of a different city, or for a global organization, perhaps a different country. But when everything shuts down, you figure out that working from home is kind of the new continuity of business. And I think we've had, more than 90% of our employees work from home, and we haven't dropped the ball on servicing our customers in every which way that they want us. And I think that's been a revelation. And I think that will post-COVID, as you know, there's a lot of thinking going around the future of work, which beyond, saving money on commercial real estate, I think has very interesting implications in a country like India on things like diversity. where, working from home has had a kind of stigma which hasn't been there in the West. And I think this will open up that flexibility to women, which I think is going to be great from a workplace perspective and diversity perspective.
Yeah, and a final brief thought from you, Jitesh, if you would. What is it that this crisis has raised in terms of opportunity or unexpected ways of working?
Well, look, I think, we've talked about the sort of acceleration of trends, particularly on the technology side. It's in many ways brought the sort of future closer. And I do think that there is the thing that India has, which ultimately, you can talk about the different, if you like, mixes that you need for economic success. And, I like to think about it in terms of the physical capital, the human capital, the financial capital. But at the end of the day, for India, the X factor is that there is this latent entrepreneurial spirit, innovation that is latent in the economy. And so on the sort of human capital dimension, really the ability to make sure that particularly the younger population that India benefits from has the right skills. And I think technology can play an immense role there. So, I mean, all of us have been looking at home education, and yes, it's had some of its sort of challenges, but equally the democratization power of that is huge for a country like India. So look, technology is India's friend in that sense, because I think it really means that you can absolutely reach the masses and create a really meritocratic society where talent, wherever it is, rises to the top. And I think that to me is a really exciting element too.
And that can only be a good thing. And that very neatly leads us on to our next session, actually, because I said we're talking about some of the kind of applications of technology this afternoon, but we're going to look at emerging technologies and how they're changing economies in the next session in just a few minutes. My thanks to you all. It's really great to talk to you, to get your thoughts on what happens next after this COVID crisis. So my thanks there to Jitesh, to Sanjeev, and to Ashu. Thank you for being with us this morning, our first panel on this stream of India Global Week. Thank you too for watching. We will be back in just a few minutes.